Vice Mics and Media. I'm Goldie Boyd. On March 24th, 1962, a boxer and his boyfriend sat together on a train hurtling along a New York City subway. Alfonso had pulled a hat down over his eyes. He was not in the mood to make eye contact with anyone just before the Saturday morning weigh-in for his world title fight that night at Madison Square Garden. It would be the third time he had faced his bitter rival, Benny Kid Paret, and a career which would eventually see him become one of the finest welterweight champions in boxing history. Alfonso went on to fight 337 world championship rounds, 69 more than Muhammad Ali. But his place in the pantheon would be darkened forever by his tragic trilogy against Paret. He had lost his world title to Paret 7 months previously. The Cuban had upset Alfonso at the weigh-in to that bout by taunting him and calling him a Maricon, which meant faggot. In boxing's macho world, there could be no greater insult, especially when it was an open secret that Alfonso was different. It was not just that he spoke of his pleasure in designing pretty bonnets for ladies, or could discuss the latest pillbox hat worn by Jackie Kennedy outside the White House. Alfonso was a gay at a time when homosexuality was derided as a disease, condemned as a sin, and classified as a crime. Even consensual sex between two adult men could result in their imprisonment. Homosexuality was a criminal act in every state of America apart from Illinois. The American Medical Association, meanwhile, persisted in classifying homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder. The renowned fighter visited gay bars most weekends, but he found it impossible to come out with a public statement about his sexual preference. It was imperative to bury the truth because a gay boxer was an unimaginable phrase. In the early 1960s, the subject was not only taboo, it was impossible to believe that any sporting hero, a man's man, could be a homosexual. Alfonso didn't think much about it. He was just happy to belong to two contrasting groups of men, whether he was fighting them or loving them. He left the subway at 42nd Street. Before a battle, he wanted the comfort of walking along the familiar streets of Times Square, where at night he laughed and danced with the Hispanic gay crowd and the old drag queens. Just before 11 a.m. that Saturday morning, on the day of the biggest fight of his life, men, women, transvestite hookers, strippers called out to him to wish him good luck. Normally, he would stop and talk to everyone. But then, Alfonso just raised his fist to his people and walked on. He would be fighting for them too. At the weigh-in, Paret was in a party mood, but Alfonso looked like he was undressing for a funeral. In his underwear, he stepped on the giant scales. The kid pointed at the marker and laughed. He could not believe Alfonso come in as light as a fairy, only weighing 144 pounds. Alfonso was about to step off the scale when he heard his trainer Gil Glancy shout, "Hey, watch it!" He whirled around. A smirking Paret feigned intercourse with him as his trainers whooped hysterically. He waggled a finger at Alfonso and said, "Hey, Maricon." Paret said in a cooing lisp, "I'm gonna get you and your husband." If a white fighter had sneered at the color of his skin, Alfonso would have just shrugged it off. But the onslaught against homosexuality ran deep and wide. A homosexual in 1962 was ridiculed as being sick and cowardly. It did not matter that, in the case of Alfonso, he was trying to become just one of 8 men on the earth to call himself a world champion at a time when boxing held profound meaning in America. Alfonso, in private, was proud that he could fall for a man. In public, he felt ashamed and angry that his secret life was being demeaned. How could Paret be so cruel? He was about to hit Paret harder than he had hit anyone before when Clancy dived between the fighters. "Save it for tonight, Alfonso," he hissed. Benny Paret had went back to the Bronx. All the mischief of the weigh-in had drained out of him. He felt lonely. Benny wished his wife Lucy had came with him to New York. He remembered how just 4 days before he left for his camp, Lucy had held him when he cried. They had taken little Benny Jr. to the zoo in Miami, but at the entrance they'd been denied and turned away. "You're colored," Benny had been told. Lucy had been stunned when her husband, rather their small son, had shed tears. The injustice reminded Benny that rather being a world champion, he still looked like a Cuban sugarcane cutter. Benny had tried unsuccessfully to persuade her to leave Miami with him so she could watch him retain his title. But for weeks, even though she had not told him, Lucy had dreamed terrifying dreams of Benny being hurt. She could not shake the images from her head. He normally never said much, but when Benny telephoned Lucy from the Bronx, the words spilled out of him like blood from a gash. His head hurt, and he did not want to fight. Lucy pleaded with him to withdraw from the contest, but Benny knew his manager, Manuel Alfaro, would never allow it. There was too much money riding on the fight. He said goodbye softly, and the line went dead. At ringside, along the cigar-wielding gangsters and bent politicians, the fight writers were still absorbing the shocking weigh-in. They could hardly believe Paret had acted so graphically, or that Alfonso had reacted with such raw pain. It had been hard for them to know how to write about the incident for their early evening editions, but Howard M. Tuckner of New York Times tried his best. He had written sensitively about the weigh-in, aware that homosexuality spelt out for forbidden territory on the sports pages. Maricon was the deadliest insult in Hispanic culture, but Tuckner was also aware that they lived in a society where liberists were still allowed to pretend that he was a straight man. Tuckner, like everyone else on the boxing beat, realized that Alfonso was a homosexual, but that did not impinge on his decency as a man and his ferocity as a fighter. Out of respect for Alfonso and a conservative world, Tuckner reported soberly that the challenger had been subjected to a slur about his sexuality. Just before 9 p.m., while ringside at Madison Square Garden, Tuckner collared young Pete Hamill and raged against the totalitarian idiots on the copy desk at the New York Times. Hamill worked for the New York Post, a tabloid, but Tuckner had made it to the peak of his profession in the supposedly magisterial sport desk of the Times. Tuckner was incandescent. The Times sub-editors had replaced the offensive word of homosexual with meaningless phrase unman. Tuckner could not believe it when, on his way to the fight, he had picked up the paper under his byline, read that Paret had accused Alfonso of being an unman. Tuckner shouted at his disbelief to Hamill. "Unman?" he yelled. "What the fuck is an unman? A butterfly is an unman. A rock is an unman." He was still yelling when the lights dimmed in the garden. A visceral roar echoed around the arena. The battle between the macho Cuban sugarcane refugee and that hat-making unman was about to begin. That night, rage and hurt poured out of Alfonso. It was a savage fight, and even though he was knocked down in the 6th round, Alfonso dominated. Carnage broke out in round 12. It started with 2 brutal right hands from Alfonso. Paret teetered backwards. He buckled sadly towards oblivion. In that moment, Griffith might have allowed the champion to fall, but he was about to punish Paret. The Cuban tried to hold his guard up, but his arms were too weak. Alfonso had a clear target of Paret's lolling head. He used his left arm to pin Paret against the ropes while he threw a soaring right uppercut again and again. Alfonso turned his body so that he could gain maximum torque with every punch he threw. Each one landed with deadening force. Paret's head rocked on a neck that looked like a broken plinth. One punch followed another in a shocking cortege. It was as if each blow was an answer to the taunt of Maricon. The blows were so savage that the referee, Ruby Goldstein, seemed helpless, as if the ferocity had struck him dumb. At ringside, they could hear the sound of every punch as if it was the distant echo of a heavy spade digging a grave. After a dozen right uppercuts, Alfonso suddenly threw the left hand. The sight of two fists drilling like pistons into Paret's defenseless head finally snapped Goldstein out of his stunned reverie. He jumped between the fighters. The only way he could stop Alfonso hitting Paret was by wrapping his arms around a man who had been deformed into a punching machine. As Goldstein and Alfonso staggered away in a drunken embrace, Paret slid down. His eyes began to close as he started to die. Paret's right arm was trapped against the ropes, while his left spread out in a surreal crucifix. At ringside, Gaspar Ortega, who fought both men, was distraught. The way in which Paret had slipped away as if he had already left his limp body frightened Ortega. He began to cry as, reaching for his wife's hand, he pulled her away. They needed to escape the garden. A few minutes later, in the middle of the ring, the television commentator Don Dunphy had not understood the outcome as completely. Here is Alfonso, the young man who has regained the World Welterweight Championship in an exciting fight with Benny Kid Paret. Alfonso, we're going to replay the knockout in slow motion videotape. I'd like you to describe what happened. Alfonso hesitated as he saw himself beating the life out of Benny Paret on a black and white monitor. He's hurt now, see, Dunphy said, encouraging Alfonso to look more closely. That's beautiful camera work there. Yeah, terrific, another voice confirmed. It was the first time in television history that a slow-motion replay had been used. They fell silent as they watched, but Dunphy, knowing that dead air on television was a crime, eventually chippered in. There it is, he said. I just kept punching, Alfonso said, horror thickening his voice. I just kept punching. Emil Alfonso Griffith beat Benny Kid Paret literally to death to regain his title, and Benny Kid Paret would succumb to all of his injuries and pass away 9 days later. Emil Griffith passed away in 2013, but the irony of that story was that Emil Griffith was not known as a power puncher. Out of the 112 fights that he had, he won 85 of them, and he only won 23 of them by knockout, and had 24 losses with 2 draws and 1 no contest. He was a 3-division champion, being the undisputed welterweight champion, a light middleweight champion, and also a middleweight champion. People might not know it, but he was also a good trainer too. He had actually trained Wilfred Benitez and Juan Laporte of Puerto Rico, and both of those guys were going to win world championships. And also, before he passed away in 2008, I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Griffith, and he was a great soft-spoken man. And his son Louis would bring him down to Westbury Post Avenue Gym, where I trained at the time, with a lot of good other guys. And he would point things out to me and talk to my trainer and tell him, hey, tell him to do this, tell him to do that. And I would get out the ring and he would say a few words to me, man. So I actually got the chance to meet the man, and I found him to be a very nice and decent man, unbeknownst to what everybody else might think of him. So I have nothing but the utmost respect for the man, and I think he was a very brave man to be a homosexual at those times, because he could have been killed for being a homosexual. He was actually attacked in 1992 coming out of a gay bar and beaten half to death and put into a hospital. So I have the utmost respect for him for having the bravery to be who he was in those times, man. Because it took a lot of bravery and a lot of heart to be who you were as a homosexual in those times, man. So enough respect and big respect, and rest in peace to the late great Emil Griffith. Rest in peace, champ. Mwah.